It's a great pleasure for me to join this esteemed panel. We're joined here right now by Daniel Crane, who's the Frederick Paul Firth Senior Professor of Law at the University of Michigan, Tim Wu, the Julia Silver Professor of Law, Science and Technology at Columbia Law School, and Genevieve Lakier, Assistant Professor of Law at Chicago. She is also the Herbert and Marjorie Freed Teaching Scholar there. You can see their bios in the program, and they're all impressive. This panel will actually take up the question that I think Michael Myers was pressuring people to talk about earlier, and that is we will squarely take up the First Amendment questions that have been lurking, and we're going to do this in different ways. Let me set things up a little bit, and then let the panelists take things away. First Amendment doctrine doesn't really begin to take shape as we know it, the modern doctrine, until after World War I, and then really after World War II. Since that time, it's protected dissidents and disfavored groups from governmental censorship and repression. That's to say civil rights activists, anti-war activists, journalists, prenatal health professionals, as well as hate groups. Advocacy has been so successful that it's now being invoked by the most powerful with great success. And this is often associated with what's been called the new Lochner. It's been invoked in the context of politics and the commercial setting. A case we'll probably hear about today, the Searle versus IMS Health case, involving a Vermont statute that restricted the sale and disclosure of records that revealed prescribing practices of individual doctors. In search, web search, the Search King case, in which first Google successfully invoked an affirmative defense on First Amendment grounds that it can make editorial decisions about search. By the way, this is in the news again today, and if you've read the Wall Street Journal on this very point. Also, something I hope we discuss later, Justice Kavanaugh's dissent, I should say, former judge of the DC Circuit, now Justice Kavanaugh's dissent in a case affirming the open internet rule a long time ago, when that was a thing, in which he recognizes a First Amendment interest at stake with regards to the regulation of intermediaries. So this is a very live question it goes far beyond protection of dissidents. It is now embedded in the way we think about commercial life. Panelists here and others have called this, as I said, the Lochner problem, invoking the notorious case in which a court privileged the right to contract over labor protections addressed to working conditions. But we are now asking the question of whether this same principle or problems are at stake here, where the democracy-enhancing public law norms and values are at stake in the battle with an enlarged First Amendment. So it's in this context that we're going to ask about the interaction between the First Amendment and antitrust. And this is precisely what Dan's paper takes up. History matters. We didn't just need to know that after Richard's presentation. History matters also because it helps to denaturalize phenomena. And if there's phenomena that existed before that's not in place today, in context of antitrust, there was a different different view a long time ago about how antitrust ought to work. We now might associate that with the new neo-Brandeisian approach that Tim Wu's written about and Lena Khan has written about. But we are also, Brandeis is one of the players in this story. Olive Wendell Holmes, as Dan points out, is his co-traveler in thinking about the interaction of antitrust and democracy and free speech norms. And this is the problem you take up. You talk about the interaction between the two, and the development are paired, in some ways in tension and sometimes together. Dan, take it away.
Great. Well, thanks very much. It's great to be here. I've really enjoyed the conference today. My paper is mostly historical, not normative. I'm sure we'll get into some normative questions as well. That can't be avoided in a room like this. But what I really wanted to do in my paper is to just provide a little sketch of sort of the foundational era of First Amendment doctrine and antitrust doctrine, and how the ideas were often paired ideas in the hands of some of the people most responsible for the creation of those doctrines, and then sort of what happens to those things thematically over the course of the 20th century. So I think everyone in this room probably knows that that the early days of 20th century First Amendment jurisprudence are heavily associated with dissenting opinions by Justice Holmes and Justice Brandeis. What is probably not as well known is that at the very same time that Holmes and Brandeis are beginning to articulate their marketplace of ideas as to First Amendment values and their dissents in the First Amendment cases, they're also in parallel writing dissents in cases involving the imposition of antitrust or unfair competition liability when that has the effect of perpetuating economic dominance and interfering with the free flow or dissemination of ideas. So in two cases in particular that I talk about in the paper, in the INS versus Associated Press case in 1918 and the American Column Antitrust Information Exchange case, Holmes and Brandeis dissent, each separately dissent, and both write was effectively a free speech type opinion about the importance of cooperation and the depropertization of information in ensuring that sort of smaller or weaker players in our marketplace, our economic marketplace, have access to information. They are very interested in issues of access and marketplace democracy. Marketplace democracy defined as an economy where lots of different stakeholders can participate freely. And they're particularly attentive to the role of coercion and dominance by gatekeepers of information and news in subverting this kind of marketplace democracy. Now, in both of those cases, like in their First Amendment dissents, they are arguing against the imposition of liability, in this case, unfair competition or antitrust liability. But the argument certainly has a more general flavor, which is that there's an important affirmative case for commercial law, for antitrust law, for unfair competition law, to pay attention to the effects of dominance and coercion on information flows, which serve important functions in the economy. Their view comes to a head with actually their descendants on the Supreme Court, not themselves, but in 1945 in the Associated Press case. Two different views about the First Amendment and how it plays with the antitrust laws are presented squarely to the court. So in 1945, in the Associated Press case, the issue is whether the Associated Press's exclusionary bylaw, which allows a company like McCormick's Tribune in Chicago to veto Marshall Field's Sun newspaper's participation in the Associated Press, is a violation of the antitrust laws. The Supreme Court ultimately holds that it is, but the reasoning is interesting. So one viewpoint on the First Amendment, that associated with McCormick, would be that the First Amendment serves as a bar to government imposition of antitrust liability on the editorial prerogatives of newspapers. Newspapers have a sort of a libertarian, classical liberal right of freedom of interference by the government in how they structure the dissemination of news. On the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, the view associated with Marshall Field would be in the Sun that the rights that are protected here are the rights of the reader or the listener. Those are the First Amendment rights that are important. And to protect those First Amendment rights, there's a special affirmative mandate for vigorous antitrust enforcement to break down these kinds of commercial barriers to the free flow of information and ideas. The case then comes to Hugo Black for decision. And Justice Black, of course, being an heir of the Brandeisian tradition as to sort of economic populism and marketplace democracy, but also a First Amendment on antitrust, an absolutist on First Amendment grounds, is unwilling to think about the case through any other lens than ordinary economic antitrust policy. In fact, he analogizes the case to one involving commodities, things like tiles or ironware or lumber, and says no more or no lesser of an antitrust rule applies to a case involving the news media than would apply in a case involving, let's say, tiles or lumber, as an American column. And so he upholds liability, but in doing so also discards or undermines the possibility that there would be a separate affirmative mandate for antitrust to take away these barriers to the free flow of information and ideas. Now, in light of the aggressive antitrust regime that comes after World War II, this is not really a problem for the news media in terms of free flow of ideas. The Justice Department brings 17 cases involving newspapers alone in the decade or two following the war, many others involving radio and eventually television. Antitrust norms were vigorous, and antitrust was used to police industries that had sensitive information flow issues. What happens, of course, though, is that the discourse turns into purely economic discourse. And you look at Justice Department cases, even ones brought in the 60s and 70s, they're not really talking about sort of First Amendment values in the media. They're talking about things like the price of advertising or the price that customers would have to pay for a newspaper. So everything gets reduced into standard antitrust economic language. Enforcement in the news media is essentially normalized vis-a-vis the First Amendment. But anything that would be a separate First Amendment value in antitrust enforcement is largely swept under the rug. And then, of course, along comes the revolution in antitrust in the 1970s, where antitrust in economic terms becomes considerably less aggressive. And you start getting questions about whether some kind of Brandeisian or Holmesian special idea of antitrust as a protector of First Amendment values would be necessary or cognizable. So that's where I think we are today. The history suggests that that theme was very much married to the themes of the First Amendment in its early years, and partly because antitrust was so aggressive during the mid part of the 20th century, it became unnecessary to talk about that in those terms. But today, as we've seen the growth of tech giants like Google and Facebook and Amazon that we've been talking about today, those questions are back on the table again.
I'll get to you, Tim, in a second, but I just want to try to emphasize something you mentioned in the paper, and I think you say a little bit, you do mention here, but like to get this fleshed out a little bit, Dan. So you do talk about how economic power is essential for how Brandeis, at least Brandeis, thinks about this, and as a democratic idea, but just power imbalances are the key concern. We have, in this economic approach today with regards to antitrust, we do have models that address to concentration, which is the vocabulary of the contemporary discourse with regards to antitrust. Is there a way that Brandeis distinguished between companies that are too powerful and those that aren't? How did he know that the line was crossed when there was an entity that was too powerful?
Yeah, that's a good question as to exactly how one identifies what the curse of bigness is. What's it mean to be big? That's, of course, Brandeis's idea, the curse of bigness. In his American column Dissent, he distinguishes between firms that are very large and already have access to information and firms that are small and will only get access to information by sharing with other firms. And in his mind, even if it turns out that smaller firms sharing information will lead to somewhat higher prices, that is an acceptable cost when the consequence of information exchange is to democratize the market and allow smaller producers to participate on even footing with larger producers. So he doesn't give us a definition of what he means by power necessarily. He's able to identify it inductively on those facts when you have several hundred smaller wood producers who are trying to exchange information that they think is necessary for them to compete against larger, often vertically integrated interests. And he sees that as, so the antitrust laws as having a space to allow that kind of activity, even though if information exchange was practiced by, let's say, the top 2 or 3 firms, that might be unlawful because it perpetuated their dominance.
Can I weigh on the Brandeis? Can I weigh on Brandeis, if that's all right? So one of the things more broadly that since we're on Brandeis, he also distinguished quite distinctly between firms that were created through massive consolidation campaigns versus organic growth. He thought this was a big deal, and often the line he drew, especially in his own time when he saw an enormous number of trusts arise, which were basically efforts to turn an entire industry into a single monopolist. that method of growth, he thought, was tended to lead in what he thought were very bad anti-democratic directions. I also think that he had an eye on, and I get this from his opposition to the building of the Hartford Railroad before he was a justice, on the usage of what he thought were very illegitimate political means to try and get what you want. That he saw the turn towards political corruption as a method of business as a sign that the curse of bigness was on you, and also signs of hidden inefficiencies and other things like that. So.
Can we actually follow up on this
Sure.
on this point? Can you explain why Brandeis had suspicions about acquisition strategy? I mean, in some ways, it sounds like maybe maybe it wasn't a virtuous way of running business as opposed to someone who builds from the bottom. I mean, can you set out what the reason was?
So Brandeis, I think, was very focused on human scale. Some people said he sort of romanticized, small business and small towns, and he lived. It's just what he saw in front of his face. He lived in an era where thousands of businesses were consolidated into giant industry-wide trusts, and I thought he thought the results were inhumane. Very tough. Particularly for labor and employees, and things aren't so great today. But in those days, sometimes when there were strikes, they'd send out mercenary armies to shoot the strikers. So I think he just saw this into sort of a grand dehumanization of what America, and particularly American, I don't know if capitalism would be the word, but American markets and American business would be. So he sort of stood out for that, holding on to the more humans. I think we've drifted a little bit from the First Amendment here, but it's worth having. And obviously, this has some relevance to our own time. I mean, I think we're at the kind of tail end of a series of consolidation campaigns in our current economy, which the precedent is the Gilded Age, I would say, and where we have levels of sustained maintenance of profit, which really do suggest something strange has gone on, and consolidations across so many industries. That's why I think we're all talking about Brandeis again, or at least where I'm talking about Brandeis.
So let's come back to the First Amendment. Tim, your paper is about the Noer-Pennington Doctrine and why it should be overruled.
Yeah.
In the context of political corruption in particular, this is what you're addressed to, so take it away.
Yeah, sure. So let me introduce my project. So I think we live in a time when concerns about corruption of the American political process by concentrated private interests have reached an apogee, and if that's the right way to pronounce that word. And I think it's not hard to see. There's so many areas where there are not just majorities, but supermajorities. 80 or 90% of Americans want something done. Let's say, for example, better controls on the prices of pharmaceutical drugs, paid leave for paid maternity leave, action on privacy, gun control. Some of these things are 80, 90%. I read somewhere the background checks are like 98% of Americans think that would be better to extend background checks. And then so many areas that you see no action, and I think this flouting of the even supermajorities, and not every one of those stories is a story about concentrated private interest, but many of them are. Tax policy is being another great example of where the political process feels heavily broken. And I want to highlight the fact, there's many things that could be done about that. But I think one of the traditional tools, or at least traditionally conceived tools for the problem of corruption or private power was the antitrust laws, and should be the antitrust laws. The framers or some of the people who put together the antitrust laws were concerned not just about economic power, but also the exertion of political power. I'll quote Senator Sherman himself, who was concerned with, he said on the floor, the concentration of capital into vast combinations to control production of trade and to break down competition. These combinations already defy or control powerful transportation corporations, talk about railroads, and reach state authorities. And there's many more examples, that's just one, of concern and a sense that antitrust is meant to serve political ends as well as economic ends. And I think with an eye to the idea that there's something inherently dangerous about concentrated private power for a democracy. So my point of my paper is that antitrust's role in carrying out this anti-corruption mission has been hamstrung by a doctrine which is probably obscure to most people in this room. I don't know if most people here are antitrust lawyers or not, but it is this the Noor-Pennington doctrine, which creates an immunity for anti-competitive actions that would otherwise be deemed anti-competitive if it can be described as political or legal advocacy. It was a doctrine created in the 1960s as an exercise in First Amendment avoidance. So the idea was that we have to keep the antitrust laws away from political activity to preserve First Amendment values. And we can have a debate about that. The problem, from my perspective, is that since then they have this doctrine has drifted far beyond any even defensible First Amendment justification, and become a sort of free-ranging immunity in the antitrust laws, unanchored to the Constitution, and has allowed has given too broad a license for companies to defraud, to deceive, to abuse government processes, to bribe officials, to engage in conspiracies with officials to gain their goals. And I think it's become time to overrule this the case that started all Noor, and to get rid of any sort of blanket overgrown immunity for activity which can be plausibly said to be connected to political advocacy. Much of what is even protected by this doctrine really has nothing to do with petitioning the government, which I obviously recognize as a core First Amendment activity. So that's my thesis. It doesn't mean that any time that people organized a lobby group to press their goals, that they would have no protections. I would replace Noor-Pennington with a First Amendment defense. You could plead, as you do in many other areas, plead that the antitrust action against you is in contravention of the First Amendment. But I think we need to, I'm coming back to the idea that we have problems in the American political system. Antitrust is designed to face some of the problems, and we need to shake loose some of the hamstringing elements, the barriers to antitrust serving its role in controlling private power. So thank you very much.
Tim, in the paper, you say that it's, well, maybe you can clarify for me, but I think you say Noor-Pennington's not really a First Amendment case because the court relies on an avoidance logic. Can you say a bit more about that?
Right. So let me, make the doctrine clear. So so the case itself, which I suggest overruling, involved a big political fight between two big industries, the trucking industries and the and railroads, were kind of the traditional opponents, hated each other with a vengeance. And the railroad industry had used a political campaign to try to hamstring the trucking campaign. The district court judge thought it was distasteful. It was a deceptive campaign. So they the railroads created all these front groups that pretended to be citizens, like New Jersey concerned drivers or all these things. This is 60s, where this kind of fake groups were relatively new, and I think fooled a lot of legislators, fooled a lot of people into believing that these were legitimate groups when they were actually front groups funded by the railroads. And so the district court was willing to entertain the idea this was a violation of the antitrust laws to build this kind of conspiracy against the truckers. So the Supreme Court said the antitrust law couldn't go there, and it didn't do so by relying on the First Amendment defense, even though one was presented, but instead interpreted the antitrust laws to include an immunity for political advocacy. And so that's what I'm talking about, that there's an avoidance. And the problem with not anchoring it to the actual First Amendment is it's allowed the doctrine to kind of grow out of control. And I think at this point, it protects a lot of activities that aren't actually protected by the First Amendment. So I'm not really sure why they're there, given that the original intent of the Sherman Act, as I understand it, did include both economic and political goals, and was concerned about the disruption or influence over state legislatures and Congress by powerful monopolies.
So I will come to you, Genevieve, in a second, unless you want to jump in on this point.
I have a question
Yeah,
that
go ahead.
ties together Tim and
Yeah,
Dan's
sure.
papers, which is, it is interesting the strategy of constitutional avoidance that the court takes up in Noor.
Can you? No one can hear you, I'm afraid. Yeah.
It's interesting that you're right, that the strategy of constitutional avoidance rather than squarely hitting the
Right.
First Amendment issue. And I was wondering if either of you have thoughts about whether the strategy of avoidance that the court takes up in Noor is continuing its approach from United States v. Associated Press, where the court also seems to have a very ambivalent view of whether or not the First Amendment how the First Amendment applies to the antitrust laws in general. So Associated Press is this really frustrating, interesting opinion by Justice Black, in which he suggests that antitrust law, it's not that it is immune from the First Amendment, this is often how it's couched today, and I think that is incorrect. The idea is that the antitrust furthers the First Amendment values by promoting competition in the marketplace of ideas, both literally and metaphorically. But the court never says it is required by the First Amendment. It doesn't hold that the First Amendment, it doesn't explain in any clear way the relationship between the First Amendment and antitrust law. And it seems like Noor is just a continuation of this sort of hand-waving when it comes to the
Right.
relationship between antitrust and the First Amendment. And so it just makes me wonder why the court is so afraid of reading antitrust as a constitutionally mandated or somehow a sort of a First Amendment doctrine, something.
What do you do?
So, I mean, the other leg of this is the doctrine on the other end of Noor, which is the Parker versus Brown immunity doctrine. So you can think about Noor as protecting kind of the inputs into the political process, the petitioning activity. And then in 1943 in Parker versus Brown, the question comes, well, what happens when a state actually regulates in an anti-competitive way? Is that preempted by the Sherman Act? And the answer, again, not in constitutional preemption terms, but certainly with shadows of Lochner. No, we're not going to get into the business as federal courts of second-guessing state economic regulations through the lens of federal antitrust law. We just got out of that business under substantive due process and equal protection, and we're not going to use the negative commerce clause or the Sherman Act to start doing that again. So I think during this time period, there's sort of a general view that there are certain kinds of constitutional values that may lurk in the background of antitrust, but we're not going to constitutionalize them.
Yeah, this might be not directly on point, but I'll say it for this audience. I tend to think, I mean, obviously the antitrust laws aren't part of the Constitution, but I see them as nonetheless playing a constitutional role in the sense that they are sort of this final check on private power. There's a lot of other smaller checks like minimum wage laws or things like that, but the sort of final check on the ability of private power to be completely unrestrained by anything else. And so I just wanted to put that out there.
Genevieve, I want to bring you into this, but before we move to the First Amendment in earnest, can we talk about the Sherman Act for a second? You've written about the Sherman Act, and I guess I want to push and see whether you are comfortable with Tim's account here about whether the Sherman Act speaks to this. I mean, you've written about the political context in which the statute emerges, and I think, as I understand it, you think of it as a kind of compromise approach as opposed to quasi-constitutional.
Yeah, so the thing about the Sherman Act's legislative history is that Tim is not wrong because you can find anything you want in the Sherman Act's legislative history. So Robert Bork famously found consumer welfare in the legislative history of the Sherman Act. He actually wasn't wrong. I mean, people have said for the last 50 years that Bork was wrong. He wasn't wrong. He just cherry-picked the one thing he wanted to bring out of it, right? So it's certainly the case that there was rhetoric around the time of the Sherman Act like the following. So, 100 years ago, we got rid of a political tyrant in King George III, and now we've seen the same kind of economic tyranny reproduced through the trusts, right? You can certainly find that, but you can find any number of things in the legislative history of the Sherman Act.
Right. I would even add, this might be a little technical, the Clayton Act also gets neglected a little bit, 1914. So if you're not sure what they meant in 1890, sometimes I think, they tried to kind of double down on it in 1914. And anyway, I'll just throw that down. They did double down on some of these things. And to even add, actually, I want to say this because one of the things that's important, in our time are these consolidation campaigns, the bringing together of a whole bunch of companies into much smaller. In the old days, it was monopolies. Today, the tendency is to consolidate an industry into 3 or 4 players who then create a sort of joint moat or a joint barrier to entry and become completely impossible to dislodge. The Anti-Merger Act of 1950 was the last major antitrust act passed. It's very clearly focused on the political dangers of overly concentrated private power and the sense that it has anti-democratic tendencies. Some of this, not all of it, but some of it was, I think, a reaction to the concerns of some of the World War II experience and the popular theory at the time that the United States had fought countries that were that had highly centralized, monopolized economies, and we need to be different to protect monopoly. That there was, brooding anti-democratic dangers in monopoly. And so, yeah, this is all there. I think a lot of it's there. And I agree you can find a lot, but you can find a lot of political concern, and the right level is not 0. That's all I'm going to say. The right level of political concern is not 0.
So I've been building up the idea that we were going to talk about the First Amendment, and
You have 2
Genevieve is,
antitrust people here, and one, I guess I'm a
you're an antitrust.
joint,
yeah.
joint,
So
joint.
Genevieve is going to rescue us, and she's going to rain on our parade, I think. Does the First Amendment impose constraints on what we can do with regards to antitrust and big tech?
So I am going to try and tell a happy and a sad story, not just a sad story. So my paper examines what the First Amendment, what constraints it imposes on the use of what I think of broadly as anti-monopoly tools to try and promote better discourse, address some of the problems on what I call the platform public sphere, or on the platforms. And so the happy story that I tell is when you think about the First Amendment, and this should be clear from Dan and Tim's presentation, if we are thinking about using antitrust mechanisms, including the big gun of breaking up big tech, as Senator Warren and others have suggested, the tool of divestiture, the First Amendment really poses no problem. Since the Associated Press case, the court has understood the First Amendment and the antitrust laws to be copacetic, to be working towards similar ends, except for the important but limited exception of the norm penitent doctrine. And so antitrust provides a totally constitutional mechanism for dealing with concentration on the internet. The problem is, if we are thinking primarily about the problems that this conference asks us to think about, which is to say quality of public discourse, political speech, targeted ads, surveillance, all of the problems that that garnered so much public attention in the 2016 election and have not gone away since. I'm skeptical that just divestiture, just using the mechanism of antitrust, is going to do much about them. And that is because antitrust was designed to prevent concentration and to limit both the political and economic power of big players. But it was never intended, and in some ways was championed, in part because it doesn't interrupt or doesn't require a wholesale transformation of the business practices of the corporations and industries that it regulates. And so even if we were to think that Facebook would be broken up, as Senator Warren has suggested, or Google would be broken up, it's likely that they would continue to operate using the business model that they use today, which relies heavily on advertising and targeting. And seems unlikely to me that any of the sort of problems I just talked about will be significantly changed. They will have somewhat less economic power, somewhat less political power, but otherwise the business model will stay the same. Now, antitrust isn't the only anti-monopoly tool or sort of a regulatory tool that is concerned about monopoly. There is also the tool of public utility regulation. I don't know if this was talked about earlier.
Yeah, it was.
Okay,
Last
yeah.
panel.
And in particular, sort of this idea of imposing a duty of fair, non-discriminatory dealings on the platforms. I like this idea. I think it's very promising. Public utility laws are designed to protect the public's right of access to important goods and services, to services that are sort of fundamental and important to our survival in the modern world. And it just seems like Google and Facebook are public utilities in that respect. And one could imagine that by requiring a kind of non-discrimination obligation on Facebook and Google, similar to, in fact, to the non-discrimination obligation imposed by the First Amendment on state actors, it would help improve the inclusiveness of the public sphere. And to the extent that we worry about exclusion and private censorship, it would help. So that's the happy story. The sad part of the story is that I think that imposing a duty of fair and non-discriminatory dealings on the platforms would almost certainly be considered unconstitutional under current First Amendment law. And this is because the Supreme Court has, for over 30 years now, held that private property owners have almost complete control, or at least private property owners who exercise some degree of editorial control over a speech that takes place on their property, so that exercise any selectivity over who comes onto their property, ordinarily cannot be required to open up that property to speech that they dislike. This is their First Amendment right of exclusion. And in Turner v. FCC, the court held that there might be a limited exception to that. Justice Kennedy wrote the opinion, but it was, and it's a very interesting opinion because it recognizes bottlenecks, concentration of power and its effects on public discourse. But the language in the opinion makes clear that this is very much an outlier, an extraordinary occasion when the court is willing to sanction this, that it has to be, what does he say? It's bottleneck control of an important medium of communication that can completely block or other speech. And this is simply not the case with Facebook or Google or the other platforms. So it seems very unlikely to me that the court would uphold a non-discriminatory dealings obligation in the face of the First Amendment challenge that would be issued a minute after the bill gets enacted. And this is particularly so, I just want to emphasize something that Oliver said, particularly so with Justice Kavanaugh on the court. So Justice Kavanaugh was on the DC Circuit that dealt with, that addressed a First Amendment challenge to the net neutrality regulations that the FCC enacted and then took back. And the majority held that the net neutrality laws did not violate the First Amendment because, as is correct, the companies that the net neutrality laws regulate, the ISPs, do not exercise editorial control over speech on their property, and so the rule that I just talked about doesn't apply. Justice Kavanaugh wrote this amazing dissent in which he said, no, it does violate the First Amendment because they could exercise editorial control over speech on their property. They never have, or they don't usually, but they could, and so the same rules apply. So this suggests a tightening and expansion of this idea that property owners have almost complete control over who enters or exits their property. And so the conclusion I reach then is that the two primary anti-monopoly tools that have been suggested to deal with problems of public discourse on the web, on the one hand antitrust, and on the other hand sort of this duty of non-discriminatory and fair dealings, neither are going to achieve their result. Antitrust because it's focused on a different target, and the public utility or the non-discrimination obligation because it's unconstitutional. So this doesn't mean that there is nothing that can be done, but it does suggest that if we are seriously concerned about problems of public discourse on the platforms, these may not be the tools we want to put all of our efforts behind. There may be very good other reasons to mobilize in favor of, in particular, divestiture or breaking up or antitrust, but not this one. And so in the paper I suggest a variety of other approaches. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them right now, but I'll just list a few. So in contrast to non-discrimination obligations, I don't think the First Amendment limits the ability of Congress to pass a content-neutral privacy regulation that requires the platforms to deal better with users' data. I also think that perhaps the framework of public utility actually provides given what I said before, the sort of the appropriateness of it to these, to dealing with these vital social goods, provides a useful framework for thinking about regulation, but the non-discrimination, sort of the core non-discrimination obligation aspect of the utility framework is not likely to be constitutional, but we might imagine other aspects of public utility regulation could be usefully and productively applied to the platform. So one of the sort of classic requirements imposed on public utilities is some kind of due process and transparency when they are denying service to customers. One could imagine that meaning some forms of transparency or due process when people are kicked off Facebook or other kinds of concerns arise. One might also imagine sort of privacy regulations as part of a public utility framework. So there's a whole bunch of things we can imagine, but given the serious First Amendment constraints, I think we're going to have to be creative.
So during the course of the conference, people have talked about, Alina introduced the idea of a toolkit available to regulators that are not limited to divestiture and public utility regulation. I'd like to ask you about some of them. And you mentioned transparency. As you were talking, I was reminded of a range of telecommunications interventions, which are, prophylactic competition law. The MCI versus AT&T case is one case I'm thinking about because it's a disagreement between Scalia and Stevens about what the Communications Act is about. But I think Stevens in dissent says that transparency is important, but publication of tariffs, right, are important in the interest of competition. So I guess I would love to hear you say a bit more about what some of these other tools, what you might think as a matter of constitutional law, as a matter of First Amendment law, what these other tools allow, or whether they're allowed. And another one is something that's come up quite a bit during this conference is adversarial, what's the word? Interoperability. I was just trying to get the crowd's participation right. So,
Say it together.
Adversarial interoperability, which as I understand it, is a mechanism that would entitle anybody, irrespective of the constraints posed by a social media company or big tech, to gain access to some feature on the social media, on the platform. This, to me, as a person who's cut his teeth in telecom law, sounds like an interconnection sort of obligation. That doesn't, to me, doesn't raise First Amendment questions, but maybe I'm not seeing it clearly. So can you speak to these?
So I don't know if I cannot give any definitive conclusions, because I think we are in a period where First Amendment law is evolving in at a fast pace. In terms of the ideas of transparency obligations, the kind of publication of tariffs equivalent for the internet age, or due process requirements, this is a classic aspect of public utility regulation. So for that reason, we might think it's going to be okay. And it's not obvious to me why that would be a violation of the First Amendment, insofar as it doesn't require these companies to host unpopular speech, host speech they don't want. It doesn't require them to associate with speech they don't want, but it does impose some kinds of disclosure obligations. And disclosure is an area where just First Amendment law is moving at light speed. I will say that, the best I could say is it's not obviously unconstitutional, but I'm sure that there would be a First Amendment fight. Because the way in which the doctrine has been developing over the past few years is to grant ever more negative autonomy rights to property owners to control all aspects of expressive activity on their property. And so to the extent that challengers, the companies, could make a claim that this somehow impedes their ability to dictate the terms under which speech occurs on their property, to select who, maybe to make it more difficult to exclude people from their property, it will be recognized as raising First Amendment questions. But it seems like a valuable tool, a bunch of tools to think about, because there has to be some limit to the kind of autonomy First Amendment, the First Amendment autonomy right that property owners possess. It's hard to imagine that the court is going to hold that everything that affects speakers or editors with respect to what happens on their platforms violates the First Amendment. But I'm sure that it will be...
Compelled speech, maybe?
Yeah.
Can I offer a
But
comment?
It's not
Go ahead.
compelled speech on matters of public concern. So I'm just going to... you gave me 2 minutes. I'm going to just give my shtick.
Go ahead.
So if I were defending this kind of thing, other than invoking public utility regulation, I would point to the commercial speech cases, which are often ragged on these days because they're part of the expansion of the First Amendment into the commercial realm and part of the sort of unraveling of the New Deal settlement. But what's so interesting about the commercial speech cases is that they allow a lot of forced disclosure in cases where there is meaningful deception or manipulation or confusion on the part of consumers. And usually we don't allow compelled speech under the First Amendment. And the way I understand those cases is it's because of the power inequality between the seller of a commercial good and the buyer of a commercial good. So those line of cases suggest that in contexts where there are these kinds of power inequalities between the platform and its users, one might make an argument for why, although in other contexts we wouldn't allow compelled speech, this is perfectly fine. But I'm not naive. I am sure that there would be First Amendment challenges.
Tim?
Yeah, if I could comment on this toolkit idea. It seems to me there's a lot, I'm kind of going to confirm with you that there's a lot of other tools that also are not constrained by the First Amendment, and I'm not sure if you are considering them because I think they're obviously unconstrained, and maybe I just want to put it. So I don't know if everyone in this room agrees on what the goal of this conference is, or even what people are interested in doing, but I'll tell you what I think, because why not? So I think, we're having, especially with on the tech side of it, I think at least I'm concerned with the problem that many of the social media platforms are exceptionally vulnerable to propaganda techniques. And propaganda I'm defining as bad faith ways of winning public opinion arguments. That's my brief. So, it's not that they're vulnerable to, having arguments you disagree with. They're vulnerable to more explicitly propagandic techniques, such as publishing of blatant malicious lies about people, such as the flooding of speech in ways, the micro-targeting techniques we talked about otherwise, and the undermining of the credibility of organizations meant to be neutral. So. There are, however, countermeasures, as I see it, that aren't, and I just want to confirm that you agree that these aren't First Amendment concerns. One of the big pushes has been to get the social media companies to essentially accept more of the duties of journalistic ethics than they have. In other words, to not allow their platforms to promulgate malicious and obvious falsehoods, or at least to label them. To control some of the volume, ways of abusing volume, to try and restrict foreign attacks on the platforms. And I take it those kinds of measures toward journalistic ethics and other kind of security kind of controls, prevent fake. I don't actually ask. Maybe it's First Amendment. Prevent deceptions as to who you are. So pretending to be American when you're actually Russian intelligence. That all those things can be done without First Amendment concerns.
You mean if it's self-regulation? The platforms agree
we're talking about putting pressure, the entire society putting pressure on. It's almost obvious, so I don't want to. Yeah. And then I also want to add another component that I think that maybe hasn't been discussed, which is trying, particular, to deter foreign attacks on American elections through national security measures. This is something I'm getting interested in myself. That also has no First Amendment bearing, as far as I can tell. So, for example, during the last election, the Army attacked Russian servers during the U.S. Army attacked Russian servers during the election, 2018, to make sure they weren't trying to hack the vote or anything like that. And that also isn't First Amendment. All I'm trying to say is, I know you agree with this. All I'm trying to say, it's not all like First Amendment or nothing. There's a lot you can do here that has nothing to do with the First Amendment.
Okay, but so I agree, but I am skeptical of efforts to about how far self-regulation can go.
Uh-huh.
I agree. I think consumers should put pressure on the platforms. They should make changes, and obviously some of the platforms are more receptive than others, and there are changes that one could imagine. To the extent, though, that these features of platform discourse are central to the business model of the platforms, to people staying on the platform, to the platform selling ads, to their bottom line. Mm-hmm. I don't think they're going to defend those, cling to those, maintain that business model as much as they can. And so I'm very skeptical about the ability of sort of the soft pressure of consumers, particularly when it's hard to find alternative sites that provide equal goods. So sort of a full-scale, long-term consumer boycott is unlikely to be on the horizon. So absent that, I'm skeptical about how effective self-regulation can be. And also, right. I'm not in favor, although this would also be constitutional. There's a lot of proposals to amend Section 230, which immunizes the platforms from liability for all kinds of speech that occurs in their platforms. And so lots of people want to amend it, and in many different ways. And that's also not, for me, an ideal tool, because that's just giving more power to the platforms to dictate what speech is and is not on their platforms.
Well, I'm actually glad, because it looks like we've reached a real disagreement.
Oh, yeah.
And that's helpful in this conference, because I think the phrase self-regulation really understates what's at stake here. Because I think we're talking about the growth, the potential growth of an actual set of professional norms and ethics in the tech industry. And you can call that self-regulation. You can call what journalism is self-regulation. But it's kind of a light term for journalists. You could say, well, why do we let newspapers self-regulate? It seems so dangerous. Why would they ever not print rumors or lies if it's going to serve their business model? And it indeed was the business model of journalism in the 19th century. But it did change. And some people might be saying you can never trust these newspapers. They just want to make money. So forget it. We better have some kind of comprehensive code that tells them what to do. But I think actually it's been a lot better to have the rise of journalistic ethics and the idea of a strong ethic. I actually, I'm not opposed to laws, but I think to give up to call it self-regulation and give up on the idea of developing self-governing ethics is to give up a lot.
I would like to bring Dan into this, but before we do, I want to push you, Tim, on this point, because the political economy of newspapers is wholly different than that for what we call big tech. As I'm sure you know, the need to expand audiences and reach in an industrial age required that they attend to an objectivity norm, right? They stop being partisan rags in order to reach more people. They would attend to norms that would allow them to reach more people. And that's arguably, it's a cynical view, but it's an argument for why the norms emerge as they do. We don't have the same sort of incentive structure for online platforms, or am I getting that wrong?
This is why I also disagree with you that breakups aren't important, or breakups don't play a large role in this, because I think one of the problems is the fact that they are so large. They feel these organizations have and they don't face competition from maybe more entities with better reputations. Maybe they will start to face such competition, but I don't have all faith in human ethics. But I think that I guess I'll go back to my point to sort of use a phrase like self-regulation to describe ethics, morality, sort of very deep historical powers that have had profound influences. And I don't think all that happened in journalism was economic. I think some of it actually was an ethical and moral reaction to what they had become. And I guess I think that morals and ethics matter, sometimes even over economics.
So, there's an empirical question, though, if you're talking about self-policing and ethics, whether large organizations, on average, are less ethical than small organizations. And I don't know the answer to that as a general matter. I have some suspicion or some skepticism, though, that if the claim is that if we simply were to fracture big tech into a number of smaller firms, that there would be a stronger tendency towards ethical self-policing. I could imagine 5, 6, 7 counter stories where actually the problem gets worse. They become fly-by-nights, so they don't care about their long-term reputation. They're in it for the short run. They don't have the resources to police themselves in the same way that a Facebook or Google does, right? So, if you're relying on self-regulation and ethics and small scale in combination, you have to convince me that you're right about the assumption.
Right. Well, do you want to go?
Well, I guess I also would like to push back a little bit on this sort of the stark divide we're talking. And maybe it's my fault because I use the term self-regulation. But one might imagine that the ways in which different companies are regulated also affects their conception of what their ethical and sort of professional obligations are. So think about the public utility that's regulated as a sort of quasi-state actor is suddenly a different kind of business entity than the business entity who is not subject to those kinds of regulations. So one might imagine that the choice is not self-regulation or law, but one might think, what are the legal tools that are going to encourage good behavior and maybe the transformation in the self-identity of the platforms? Because, of course, behind the sort of constant claims of people like Zuckerberg that they're not publishers, they're not speech companies, is this idea, is a desire to avoid certain forms of obligation, maybe social, maybe legal. And so it is an interesting idea to think about how do you shift the identity of the platforms so that they conceive of themselves in different ways, but with the goal that then they would have this kind of self-policing aspect.
Genevieve,
But
one of
it's
the
just not obvious to me that you can do that without some kind of regulatory push, at least right now, especially given the very strong economic incentives that are propelling them to the kind of bad business practices that they're currently employing.
Gen-
Go ahead.
you want to quickly reply to that? Well, Genevieve, in your paper, you talk about targeted advertising, and we just had a panel that had a pretty, excited conversation about this. And I'd like to turn to that because you're talking. I think what you're describing is, if it's not an ethical shift or if it's a self-identity question, is there a way we can tinker with the business model that allows companies to look at themselves a little differently? And your paper does talk about that as a possibility. Zephyr would argue that we ban them altogether.
Ban what?
Targeted advertising. And maybe you can say a little bit about how that might shift, if at all, this self-identity.
I don't know. I mean, I think it would have a profound effect on the business model. I'm just thinking that, wow, that is a bold idea. So
Not as bold as banning all advertising. I'll take it.
Well, there's contextual. So just to put some context, it is bold, but we're here talking about bold ideas.
yeah, I mean,
There are still opportunities to make money on advertising. There was a question about whether advertising where all that money would go. I mean, there'd be opportunities. Contextual advertising is one such thing. I'm sure entrepreneurs would come up with another. It would affect the self-identity of the companies and would tinker with the business model in ways that maybe antitrust, as you write in your paper and Dan has mentioned, don't really engage.
it's interesting. I mean, and there is always the idea of moving to subscription-based, fee-based services.
Right.
So much of this, the arguments in favor of allowing the companies to do whatever they want is, it's free, so how is the consumer being harmed? And so there is an alternative approach, which imposes greater barriers of entry, right? Means that people are going to have to pay for it, which has significant cost for if we're thinking about inclusivity, but would obviously produce a radical shift in images, in the self-image of the companies and in consumers' relationship with the companies. When you're paying for a subscription service, you have a very different relationship to the person to the company that you're paying or the newspaper that you're paying for. You have a kind of intimate personal relationship that is lacking when you don't have to pay, and so one might imagine benefits to that. And I just don't know enough about whether banning targeted advertising would be essentially moving to a subscription-based service or not.
Dan, did you want to say something?
Well, it just seems to me, first of all, obviously you can't, it would not work to continue to permit targeted ad-based services and also then hope that we'll move towards subscription-based services because people will just gravitate towards what's apparently free, like we do now. That's the reason we have targeted-based advertising across all these platforms, is because people perceive it as free. So you would then, I think, have to, in a heavy-handed way, prohibit targeted-based advertising. I think that, I'm not a First Amendment person, but that seems to me would raise very serious First Amendment questions.
The claim would be that targeted advertising is per se deceptive to consumers?
No. Tim, you were going to say something.
I wanted. I don't. Dan, I think you made an overstatement there by saying that it's obvious that free advertising models win. I mean, if you look at Netflix, for example, one of the most fastest growing companies. Some people said, well, you'll never have a subscription-based TV thing when people like free TV. But so I just think it's not clear. Absolutely, there's a long contention between advertising and subscription models. I tend to think, the attention merchants. I tend to think that there's something quite dangerous about pure advertising-driven models that does lead in different directions. But I want to talk about a First Amendment-friendly way of banning targeted advertising, which isn't a ban on targeted advertising. I think is a challenging First Amendment proposition. But if you had strong privacy laws that severely curtailed the certain forms of collecting data, if we're experimenting with this idea, if you have very strong, not just the usage of data, so the GDPR, the European laws, people may know in this room is all about how data is used, but has very little limits on what data is collected. So if you had strong limits on data collection, that would automatically heavily reduce the utility, the ability to profile people in any way that's particularly accurate. And then you, in that way, would get rid of targeted advertising. So the best way to carry out what Zephyr's talking about is actually through a very strong privacy law that is very focused on data collection as opposed to data usage. I just want to put that out there. And I think it's a totally different First Amendment analysis.
That is very interesting. It does make me worry a little bit. You know, in my paper, I argue that privacy regulation actually doesn't pose a very serious First Amendment problem if it's thought through. The court handed down this case that Oliver talked about called Sorrell v. IMS Health, which many have read as posing very significant First Amendment constraints to privacy laws. And it is true that in that case, the court invalidated a privacy regulation. But the sort of central concern of the court in Sorrell was this idea that when the Vermont legislature enacted the law, they were trying to go after particular kinds of speakers, which were pharmaceutical marketers, and made an exception for public health researchers and other groups who could get access to this private data about physicians' prescribing practices. And so Sorrell has largely, I think, been read as a law that says, well, if you're going to enact a privacy law with an effort to restrict a particular kind of speech, that's a First Amendment problem. But otherwise, so long as the speech you're regulating doesn't obviously touch on matters of public concern, you can probably do it. And so in general, I think privacy laws, like the GDPR, are fine under the First Amendment and would be fine under the First Amendment, barring major doctrinal evolution at a rapid pace, which you can never totally discount. But Tim's idea, which I think is extremely interesting, though, it does start to smell a little bit like Sorrell, which is to say it is a privacy regulation, but I guess it's not viewpoint discriminatory. It's a privacy regulation that is intended to restrict certain kinds of speech.
No, it's just a restriction on collecting, certain forms of data. For example, collecting any data beyond what you want. The Sorrell case, which I detest with a passion, I have trouble talking about calmly, but the essential what the Supreme Court, as opposed to the Second Circuit, seized upon was the idea they'd chosen one use of this data, which was targeting of doctors, and selected that and allowed other forms of usage of data for research. So the idea that it was a sort of a But
is it so different insofar as, to the extent that this is a privacy law that its aim would be to prevent targeted advertising?
I didn't say that. I just said
You just admitted that. We have it on tape, Tim. Tim admitted his purpose. Right now, when I'm challenging the constitutionality of the law that comes out of Tim's mind, I'm going to cite the tape where he started by saying the function of this is to kill a certain kind of speech online.
I think you said that. I think I think what I said is there's too much data being collected, or what I'm saying now is there's far too much data being collected for for purposes way beyond what is needed for the functions you're asking for. It's just sort of random data collection, and we're concerned about that kind of excess of data collection is what should be banned. So I don't. So anyway, that would be my most constitutional way of bargaining. It wouldn't be a ban on targeted advertising. It would be something that makes it ineffective.
So I've been given a signal that it's time for questions from the audience. So let's start from all the way in the back. If you can introduce yourself, please.
Hi, Ramsey Woodcock, Law and Business Schools at the University of Kentucky. In an article in the Yale Law Journal in 2018, I tried to lay out how we could go about banning all advertising using the antitrust laws without violating the First Amendment. And the key idea is, in the information age, when we can get all the useful product information that we want from the internet, the information function of advertising is gone. That means that advertising now is purely manipulative in function. And that makes it anti-competitive because it drives consumers away from products that they would normally prefer to the products of the firm that's engaged in advertising. It also gets us around any kind of First Amendment concern, because if you look closely at the First Amendment cases, they only protect advertising to the extent that it's informative. because the information function contributes to a better functioning marketplace. I'd be interested in the thoughts of the panel about this approach to banning advertising.
I just want to say one thing. I told you banning targeted advertising was moderate. I told you that was moderate, that there was...
All advertising. It's a very interesting argument. And you asked about whether it's about in the context of fraud and misrepresentation. I think we have an argument for why it would be.
I'm not persuaded. It's interesting, though. It is true that the court has constantly said the reason it protects advertising is not because of advertisers, but because it wants to protect the free flow of information to the public. But it has never distinguished between advertisers that convey factual information, the kind of information that you can get when you Google, like, 9 out of 10 dentists prefer which toothpaste, from the image advertising that is so pervasive. And one could say, well, the court just hasn't thought about it. But another argument would be that advertisements communicate a tremendous amount of information that you cannot Google by just looking up information on the web. They provide information about how fun a product is and how you might use it, and they make it cool and sexy. Now, you might read that as manipulation. It's unlikely to me that the court is going to read it as manipulation, and it's not clear to me what that means for it to be manipulation. Advertising conveys a tremendous amount of information to consumers that make them choose among products, and only some of that information is the kind of factual information that you can Google. And I'll just say, frankly, like, just putting my cards on the table, I really love targeted advertising. I love it when I'm on Facebook and I, like, send something, I need to buy a bag, and then 7 bag ads come up. I find that very useful information, different, qualitatively different than the kind of information I would get.
So put up your hand if you like targeted advertising. Put up your hand if you dislike it. So you're in the minority. I just wanted to...
It's a special group here. Can the person who asked the question, can you say your name and the article again? The title of the article.
Name is Ramsey Woodcock, and the article is called "The Obsolescence of Advertising in the Information Age."
Thank you. John.
So, is this working? I wanted to ask Professor Wu a question. Your comments about ethics and norms and the companies, right? Now, if you might have been thinking or might not have been thinking about Facebook, which is a self-help issue here. But the interesting thing about them is that's not an ethics code. It's not a journalistic ethics. It's a institution that involves 3 things: Facebook, a trust, and a board of oversight, right? That's made independent by the trust from Facebook. And so I guess a couple of questions. One is, how do you see that kind of additional, beyond just ethics, kind of institutional framework? And 2, isn't it true that if this Facebook scheme, they've talked a little bit about it being spread, and somewhat in a way that you were talking about, I think, for the entire...
What did you say, spread?
Well, Facebook has said, Zuckerberg has said, if this works, it might be applicable also to other companies in the space, right? But it seems to me that antitrust concerns or other companies' response to antitrust concerns would almost kill that idea right from the start. So I'd like to get your response to those 2, and anybody's response on the question of what they think about ethics and the board, since everyone had something to say about norms.
Sure. No, and I'm not just talking about Facebook. I'm talking, I think I'm hunting big game here. I think ethics matter more than law in almost most areas of human endeavor, right? So I think we should never use the phrase just ethics as if it's this throwaway. Like, I think most of our daily lives are governed far more by ethics than law, far more by morality. I think the fact that when you go to a doctor, the doctor feels some kind of ethical duty to do no harm matters more than malpractice laws and things like that. So that's where I start from. And I think we're in the middle of a process where the forget the industry, where people who work in tech are starting to gain an understanding of their own powers and their own responsibilities, I hope, and are gradually groping towards this idea that maybe they are a profession that is handling very dangerous things and has had dangerous effects, and, in my view, needs to sort of self-evolve into understanding their own duties to do no harm when it comes to things like elections or or retail, or I don't know, other areas where they just seem to, or just where they seem to be doing more harm than they realize without even thinking about it. Because I work in Silicon Valley too, and most of the time we spend our time like, how do we do something cool, and think not at all about any of the consequences, right? So I think anyway. So this is a broader thing, and at Facebook, the Facebook Appellate Board is part of that sort of lurching process. But I see this as a big, the big fight here is to have tech understand its own professional responsibilities.
I think we've, for good reason, maybe veered away from the focus on the First Amendment. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and channel Jack Balkin's argument about fiduciary duties in connection with the point you've just made about standards of care. And also invoke the Lena Khan, Dave Posen answer, which is that these are companies that are conflicted, that they're not like doctors. There's an ethic of care with regards to patients, but who are the patients in the context of Facebook or whomever, right? That they're two-sided markets or three-sided markets or whatever. Where do you come out on this, Tim? And of course, I'm opening it to everyone, but on the question of whether ethics plays a role here.
I mean, I have run it away from the First Amendment, but it's a good challenge. So first of all, I think it starts with individuals and a realization that people who are in the tech sector need to understand themselves as people with potential great power, and great power comes with great responsibility. So it sort of starts at an individual, even among. I mean, one of the things I think is the most promising thing happening in Silicon Valley right now are these employee protest movements, basically on ethical grounds, where they're, for example, at Facebook, they're saying, why are we running malicious, defamatory political ads? Like, how did this have to do with our mission to connect the world or whatever it was supposed to be? And Google employees saying, why are we building a sensorial search engine for China? This is wrong. I think so. It's part of it is individual. I think this starts to get into corporate governance. I think the choice of these firms to set themselves up as standard, Delaware corporations with the duties to maximize profit has been bad for the sector, and those structures and those incentives are dangerous. But I think this is not a quick, but that is the fight, and I think it is the sort of real fight is to get back to the sense that overcome these sort of inhuman, what I would describe as almost inhuman duties to maximize revenue or growth, and be much more concerned about the harm being done. Yeah, sorry.
I'm not sure. I mean, I'm a First Amendment person, so I'm not so sure we can keep it entirely away from the First Amendment. I do agree that the protests that are happening at Facebook are extremely interesting. But in part, that's because Facebook has been such a bad actor. Not checking the veracity of ads at all. Facebook is just, it seems like it's daring its both customers and employees to respond. And so perhaps that kind of protest is going to lead to, I bet it is going to lead to a moderation in policies at Facebook, but one must recognize that the moderation would be from the extreme kind of crazy policy to a slightly less extreme crazy policy or destructive policy. And the problem with just saying, well, let's not think about law, let's not think about the Constitution, let's talk about self-regulation, is that as we saw Mark Zuckerberg start to do a few weeks ago, the companies are going to drape themselves in the First Amendment, and the ways in which they're going to communicate to their employees that what you're doing is a good thing, targeted advertising is a good thing, promotion of whatever speech is a good thing, is because this is free speech promoting, and they're going to be liberators of public discussion. And so there is going to be this First Amendment penumbra that is going to have to be negotiated with. Right.
I mean, I'll reiterate, I've called for the breakup of Facebook, and I believe strongly in regulation of platforms that are economically necessary. So I am in no way opposed to law, but I'm just saying if we sort of say, look, I agree with you. You can't just say, well, we can trust Mark to be a good guy because, he's a nice, and I had lunch with him once and he seemed okay, so that's cool, but fine. I'm not into that sort of Hooverist kind of stuff, which was just like, we'll just have these guys be nice and talk to them. But I do think the the development of ethics should not be disregarded. That's all I'm saying. I just think that the development of ethics in this area, I almost think is of extreme importance. And, it doesn't mean necessarily people in this room altogether, but I think that's a really important project. And that's sort of a journalism school way of thinking about it. And I go back and I say, what were the conditions? Maybe we should study what were the conditions that led to journalistic ethics, which are imperfect, but they still do a lot of work in our society. And the media companies have no ethics in not the media. The tech companies have no ethics in these areas, and that is a just gaping black hole. So maybe we should go to more questions. I'm sorry to.
Dan, you were going to lean in there.
No, I'm still wondering how Tim will explain the way in which structure affects ethics.
Okay. Do you want me to get to that, or should we take more?
It's more
Well,
rhetorical.
I'll go. No, I'll answer that question. I have a lot to say about it, but I'm nervous we're not having.
Well,
any
so
questions at all.
we have a couple more minutes left. It's a good question. I actually wanted to ask a similar question. Maybe we can make that is an unsure question. You have to have some confidence there. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Actually, this maybe is a question for the moderator, but I'd love to hear everybody else's opinions on this too, and it does relate to this ethics question. You argued that newspapers professionalized out of a business incentive to reach wider audiences, and I found that really interesting. You said that the platforms didn't have that incentive. In my paper, I actually argued the opposite, that in some ways, because of network effects and because all of the platforms are competing for the market, that they have a very strong incentive basically to appeal to the moderate person with their content moderation principles. And so they're all going to basically have the same set of, within some variants of moderation, content moderation approaches, and thus breaking them up may not add a lot of diversity to their approaches. But it occurs to me that this may argue that these platforms will shift towards more ethical approaches in order to keep, whether it's to appeal to their customers, the average customer, or the average employee, and that maybe the transformation will happen somewhat similar to the way it did in the newspaper. So I'd be curious about the response from the panel on that.
So I appreciate that you've asked me the question. This is something I'm thinking about, and for those people who know anything that I've written, I've actually I think you're far too hopeful on this. I think that the reason the tech companies have turned in the direction they have is because of public pressure and threat of litigation. The substantial cover that these companies have under the immunity under Section 230 has actually not achieved the market in moderation that the developers of that immunity conceived, right? So that's my short answer. But I think it's a well taken point. Anyone want to say something on this?
Well, can I just jump in on the ethics point?
Yeah.
So I've just been thinking about this. I mean, it is really interesting, this challenge to a very law-focused approach, and to think about journalism and the self-identity of these companies. I mean, the thing about journalists is that they understand themselves to be intermediaries between serving the public good, between sort of the government and the public. We have this long history of thinking about journalism as the fourth estate. They have a kind of quasi-governmental role, and they take that seriously, and that imposes the kinds of obligations that we think are imposed on government employees. It does seem like one of the big problems with how we think about the tech companies, and also how First Amendment law thinks about the tech companies, is that it doesn't see them as governors in any way. It sees them as participants in the public sphere or money makers, so they're subject to the same rules that people who participate in conversation. There's no difference. And so it does seem as if both in the First Amendment and when it comes to sort of self-regulation or ethics, an important shift would have to be to get them to think of themselves in the way journalists think of themselves, as playing not just a role as a sort of participant in the hurly-burly public sphere, but somehow a mediating function, a quasi-governing function. But they, of course, are pushing against that as far as they can.
Well, the question is, how do you create that incentive? Dan asked. Oh, go ahead, Tim.
Can I answer Dan's question?
Yeah, right. So
On,
Dan asked this.
on
Can you
ethics
repeat your
and,
question?
So I could. Can
Well,
I
you can
repeat your
repeat the
question?
question.
Go ahead. Yeah, sure. Well, no. Can I try and summarize it and tell me if I'm wrong? So the question is whether, in fact, breakups, non-monopoly, a more competitive industry, actually leads to competition, leads to ethical behavior, or whether, in fact, competition tends to bring out the worst in some ways. Is that right? Fly by night. I remember, the bottom feeders, the do anything to win kind of attitude. Is that right? So I think my answer to that is that there's structure and then there's structure, which is to say that I'm not necessarily suggesting that atomistic, a total atomistic level, highly deconcentrated competition leads to ethical behavior. What I am saying is that monopoly or maybe even duopoly, extremely limited competition, gives a certain impunity, an ability to get away with unethical behavior that isn't punished at all. And I'm thinking, here's a contrast. You know, Facebook went through all these outlandish privacy scandals, which a huge percentage of the American population felt, and survived without any loss in market share. Now, you could say that's because Americans don't care about privacy. You could also say there wasn't an alternative if they were upset. I contrast that with, say, Uber and Lyft. When Uber went through this set of scandals, sexual harassment and spying on people, all these other scandals, suddenly Lyft had this enormous gain in market share. And so I think if you have at least a few, I agree with you that the old argument that you can have competition that goes all the way down to just promoting bad behavior. But there's somewhere in the middle, I kind of associate this with Brandeis, like I do everything, where you have competition as an ability to provide some check, some punishment for unethical behavior that consumers notice. So that's my answer.
So we are out of time. Please join me in thanking this wonderful panel.